Hello, this is Chris Fleming, and I suddenly realise now I am looking too relaxed. So I'm going to have to sit up a bit straighter, put my leg down. I'm from the School of Humanities and Communication Arts at Western Sydney University. I got the name change right. And this is the week 6 wrap-up of Philosophy and the Good Life, which was our second week on Stoic philosophy. We looked at the work of Epictetus. So what we did this week was we really divided the workshop up into 3 sections. The first section we turned to a question to do with philosophy as a discipline, what it has a right to speak about or not speak about. The second, we looked at Stoicism as a philosophical system in general terms. And as I say, Stoicism, a plane is flying overhead almost as a joke, I guess, to suggest of the things that I cannot control. And the third, we looked particularly at the Enchiridion by Epictetus. So to start with the first point, one of the interesting things during the week was a student emailed me a question. And the question was, why is it that philosophy feels like it can talk about happiness? We can understand that philosophy will talk about ethics, or that philosophy can talk about metaphysics, or philosophy will talk about any range of things traditionally within its scope. But why do we think that it can talk about happiness? After all, we do have other disciplines that talk about human psychological well-being. The most well-known of these, of course, is psychology. So why is it that philosophy thinks it can encroach on psychology's territory and start talking about these things in a way? After all, psychology is a science, it does experiments, whereas philosophy just, is a matter of introspection or thinking through concepts. Now, let's just take that for granted for a moment. You can contest that definition, but it was interesting to ask people what they thought about that. That if someone did challenge them and say, well, you're looking at happiness, why would you be looking at that in philosophy? Why wouldn't you learn about that in neurology or, the chemistry of happiness? Or why wouldn't you look at that in psychology, which is kind of empirically based? And it was very interesting, some of the answers that you gave. One of the answers that people gave was that, well, psychology doesn't own this issue. In fact, the question of happiness is not restricted simply to psychology. It's a broader question. And in fact, psychology has to be able to define happiness in a way in order to measure it. And where else is that definition going to come from than from philosophy? Another line of approach is to say that, well, philosophy has talked about this for 2,500 years. There's no reason to stop now. And the third approach, and one that I pursued for a little while, was to look and compare what has now become a psychological orthodoxy, which is cognitive behavioural therapy. That's like the official therapy of clinical psychology in Australia and England and a whole range of places, often considered to be the most scientific form of psychology. Well, I showed through a series of quotations and a series of conceptual analyses that cognitive psychology, as we understand it, is really just a developed form of Stoicism. Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck go so far as to say that really what they've done is codified what the Stoics did. So in a sense, psychology, in drawing on these supposedly scientific principles, is really just doing a kind of philosophy under a different name. It's a provocative answer, I realise. Have a think about it and see what you make of that. So the second thing that we turned to was Stoicism as a philosophical system. Now, Stoicism developed after Plato's Academy was set up and the Lyceum by Aristotle was set up. It was another school of philosophical thought, considered one of the Hellenic schools. And it was, if nothing else, an incredibly consistent, that is, internally self-consistent form of thinking. It had a physics, it had a logic, and it had an ethics. Now, why I stumbled over the word logic then is it includes a lot of things within logic that we'd now consider part of epistemology, a theory of knowledge, and so on. And one of the things that happens to Stoicism over the period of its development, it goes through several phases, is that it begins to de-emphasize the issues of metaphysics and logic, or physics and logic, and more concentrate on questions of ethics. In a similar way that Socrates increasingly or wanted philosophy to turn back to questions of how to live. Well, even within Stoicism, that tendency is seen once again. So by the time you get to the kind of third wave development of Stoicism, which is Roman Stoicism, which is the Stoicism we're looking at, the Stoicism of Marcus Aurelius, of Seneca, of Epictetus, really what they are doing is basically ethics and only ethics. Now, they do refer back to cosmology and physics and so on, but that's not their primary concern. The world of the Stoics is an interesting and a slightly bizarre one for us to think about now. It is a totally materialist world. The only thing that exists in the Stoic world is matter, or what they would call translators bodies. Anything that wasn't a body didn't exist for them, so concepts didn't exist and so on. Now, having said that, the Stoic world was also this material world, which these days, if someone says that the world is just matter, then they'd be considered an atheist. Whereas the Stoics were not atheists. The material world for the Stoics was imbued with the mind of God. In fact, the Stoics considered every person as a kind of fragment of God and possessing something of the divine reason within them. And it was that part, what I talked about in the seminar as the active part, the active principle in matter, which is the soul when it comes to the individual, or God when it comes to the universe as a whole, that animates matter. It itself is matter as well, and you have to go back to the seminar for a discussion of this, about these active and passive elements and how they relate to the four elements: air, fire, water and earth. It's not super important that you get all of that, but it is important that you know that for the Stoics there is a sense of divine providence in all matter, that we are supposed to tap in and live in accordance with. Now, for the Stoics, that connection between matter and our own behaviour is wrought by ideas of nature. That is, we're supposed to follow nature, because nature is a manifestation of God, is a manifestation of providence, and so on. This is the kind of background, these are the background issues. By the time we get to Epictetus, he's not really talking very much about metaphysics. In fact, again and again in the discourses, he says, look, you people just want to talk about logic, you want to talk about words and arguments. That's really what you want to do. He said, I'm not interested in that. I'm just interested in figuring out how to live. And that's really what he tried to do. So we looked at the Enchiridion, which is a book which means ready to hand, or handbook, this kind of summary of Epictetus's teaching. And one of the points that he starts with that is very important for Epictetus is this idea, this fundamental distinction that we are in fact in control of certain things about our world, and we are not in control of certain things. And that it's very important that each of us figures out what we can control and what we can't, and to reconcile ourselves to the things that we cannot control. A lot of the time we get upset about stuff that we've got absolutely no control of. Well, for Epictetus, this was a really important distinction to be able to make, and to reconcile oneself that what happens outside one's own mind, largely, is not under one's control. So this is a central point for Epictetus, and really the basis for all of his teaching. One of the other major points that we talked about in the seminar was this distinction between an impression and thoughts about those impressions. So at various points he says that we may have an impression, that is a kind of sense experience, something may appear to us, an event may happen, and Epictetus wants us to slow down and understand that there is a distinction between what happens to us on the one hand and the kinds of things that we make up about that on the other. So we have events that occur to us, and then we have commentary on those events. And Epictetus says we've got to be careful, because it's often not the events themselves that we find upsetting in the world, but our commentary about them. In fact, most of our language tends to imply that other people are responsible for our happiness. So we'll say things like, you upset me, rather than you did something and then I made myself upset about it, which is really close to what Epictetus would say, is that people do things and then we have a series of thoughts about those things that will upset us. So it's the cognitive component, and this is really what cognitive therapy got out of Stoicism. Now, obviously, if this summary this week has seemed condensed to you and a lot of complicated ideas, go back and have a listen to the seminar. And if you want, email me or have a chat and we can sort out some of these things. Now, next week we turn to Seneca, probably, at least as far as I'm concerned, the most interesting of the Stoics and certainly the most readable. We are looking at some of his writings, and he's living around the same time as Epictetus, so there's a lot going on. But I will leave it there and just leave you with those thoughts, and I hope to see you in the seminar. Take care.